the lentils, and I'm going to explaining this morning why some of the things that we're giving you is so good to give you, because it's important to know why. Isn't that true?
In this video, Barbara O'Neill explains the link between diet, body pH, and cancer prevention. She highlights how cancer thrives in acidic, low-oxygen environments and shares practical tips for alkalizing the body, boosting oxygen, and cutting sugar. Barbara also breaks down which foods are acid-forming and which are alkaline, offering simple ways to improve health through better dietary choices. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss out on future videos.
Cancer loves acid. Cancer also loves no oxygen. So knowing those things, it makes a lot of sense to alkalize the tissues. And even though there's the drop of only 1 point, the drop of 1 point means 60% less oxygen available at the cellular level. The other thing cancer loves is sugar. So these are the 3 common denominators I find. And so when people come to us wanting help to conquer cancer, you see what we do? We suggest a diet that's highly alkalizing. We suggest ways to oxygenate the body. In fact, some health retreats have hyperbaric chambers. Have you heard of those? We have one, and it puts oxygen in under pressure. And we also greatly eliminate the glucose, the sugars going into the body. What foods have an acid effect and what foods have an alkaline effect? And this will enable you to ensure that you're having a more alkaline diet. So we're going to have a look at alkaline foods and we're going to look at acid foods.
She goes on to describe how at her health retreat, they recommend an alkalizing diet, methods to increase oxygen intake, and significantly reducing sugar consumption. She mentions hyperbaric chambers as a tool to oxygenate the body and talks about the difference between acid-forming and alkaline-forming foods.
And you might be surprised to see that the first alkaline food I'm putting up here is the humble lemon, and you might say, no, the lemon's acid. It is. And it's acid where it should be. There's only one part in the body that should be acid. You know where that is? Stomach. It must be acid. If someone says, I've got a very acid stomach, I say, praise God. Because if you don't have an acid stomach, you can't break your proteins down. Dark green leafy vegetables are also alkaline forming. Dark green leafy vegetables we should be eating every day. That's your kale, that's your parsley. Also vegetables. Vegetables have an alkaline effect, but there is a question mark with vegetables. I'm putting a question mark here because for some people these have an alkaline effect and sometimes an acid effect. There's the tomato and bell pepper, or in Australia we call that capsicum. Also eggplant, and some countries call this aubergine. And last is the potato. Now this is not the sweet potato. The sweet potato is actually not a potato. The sweet potato is a yam. I'm referring to the English potato or the Irish potato. This is the nightshade group of vegetables, and for some people they have an acid effect, and for some people they have an alkaline effect.
She then lists several foods that can have varying effects, such as tomatoes, bell peppers, eggplants, and potatoes, which may be either acidic or alkaline depending on individual reactions. She also speaks about the antioxidant lycopene found in cooked tomatoes.
So the choice is yours, the question mark's there. If you love this food, if you have no reaction and no arthritis, enjoy. Lycopene is a potent antioxidant and it has the ability to reduce the inflammation of the prostate gland, so that's good news, isn't it? So every man over the age of 40 should be having a cooked tomato and olive oil dish maybe 3 or 4 times a week. That's not hard. Lovely base for your for your chickpeas, your tomatoes, your lima beans, and lentils and soy are the 3 alkaline forming legumes. For your grains, the millet is alkaline. We had millet this morning. It's a delicious grain, isn't it? I'm sure you can understand when I said it needs to be dressed. It's basically a bland grain, but it's very nice with the stewed apple and the pear cream and the sprinkles on top. Or it's also very nice if you have it with savoury, your lentils. Quinoa, I think we'll be having quinoa at another breakfast time. These are alkaline grains, but they're also gluten-free grains, so that's made them very popular. Amaranth. Amaranth is a grain that's not very well known. I think the Aztecs, traditionally they've eaten the quinoa and the amaranth. It's a very tiny grain, and when you cook it, it goes like a lump of glue. But what I often do when my grandsons are with us, because they like a porridge, I'll put a little amaranth with the millet, or I'll put a little amaranth with the quinoa, or if they have oats, I'll put a little amaranth with the oats. So that's quite nice. Spelt. Spelt and kamut are wild hybrids of the original wheat. So let me give you the wheat story. The original wheat that God made is called Enkenhorn, or some call it just Enkhorn. And that original wheat had a very fragile protein or gluten structure. It is not sure when, but they estimate a couple of 1,000 years ago, Enkenhorn did a wild hybrid with a field grass and came up with the Emma strain of wheat. Its structure, its protein or gluten structure is not as fragile, but it's still fairly fragile. And in the 1950s, it was the Emma strain of wheat that was put through intensive crossbreeding, and it came up with the hybridized wheat that we know today. That hybridization of the wheat created an incredibly complex gluten or protein structure. Yesterday we looked at the starch that was changed, but today we're looking at how the hybridization process changed the gluten or the protein structure, and it's almost only a cast iron gut that can break down that very complex protein or gluten structure. That explains why so many people are gluten intolerant today. So coming back to our alkaline forming foods, the 2 nuts are your almond and Brazil. And all your seeds have an alkaline effect. So what has an acid effect? Before we go there, there's one other, is fruit. Now I've got a question mark with fruit too. Why have I got a question mark? If someone has a yeast presence in their body and they're eating a lot of fruit, the sugar in the fruit will feed the yeast. And as the yeast feeds on the sugars in the fruit, it gives off acetic acid. It gives off lactic acid. It gives off uric acid. So it basically is feathering its nest. So when a person has a yeast presence and they're eating a lot of fruit, can you see that they are feeding the problem? And they're creating the environment of 5.5 where yeast loves to live. And alcohol is also given off. Alcohol breaks down in the body to acetaldehyde. And acetaldehyde is a neurotoxin. We don't want a neurotoxin. A neurotoxin is a brain killer. There are 5 places you can be exposed to acetaldehyde. Yes, if someone consumes alcohol. Yes, if someone has a yeast problem and they're having a lot of fruit, it will break down to this. cigarette smoke, car fumes give off acetaldehyde, and the last one is vinegar. We don't use vinegar here, we use lemon. Lemon is far superior.
Moving on to alkaline grains and legumes, she mentions lentils, quinoa, and amaranth, explaining that these grains are not only alkaline but also gluten-free, making them popular. She gives a brief history of wheat hybridization, which has led to complex gluten structures, causing gluten intolerance in many people today. She concludes by discussing alkaline nuts like almonds and Brazil nuts, along with a caution about fruits for those with yeast issues.
Let's have a look at acid-forming foods now. These acid-forming foods are high in the acid-forming minerals, which is phosphorus, sulfur, and chlorine. So what foods are high in phosphorus, sulfur, and chlorine? Meat. This explains why Dr. Colin Campbell found he could turn cancer cells on and off like a switch by the amount of meat and dairy products he was giving the rats. Refined sugar, it's very acid forming. The hybridized wheat, the hybridization of the wheat created a lot more of the acid forming minerals. Aged cheese, what's the blue in the blue vein cheese? The blue in the blue vein cheese is mold. So the only cheeses that don't sit under that category, the cheeses that have probably a pH of 7 would be your fresh. So that's your cottage, your ricotta. I'm not saying that they are okay, because usually they come from cows who have not been fed right or have chemicals in them. But on the pH scale, they're not as acid. Caffeine, all your caffeine foods and drinks have an acid effect. And of course, caffeine usually comes hand in hand with the sugar, which certainly ups it. And remember our 2.6 Coca-Cola, that's a combination of the caffeine and the sugar. Did you know that Coca-Cola is called Coca-Cola because I think it was in the early part of the 20th century they put cocaine in it. And then they went over to caffeine, which is just as dangerous. Alcohol is not a food, but it creates an acid environment in the body. Tobacco is not a food, but it also creates an acid environment in the body. All your other grains, other than the grains that sit on the alkaline side, all your other legumes, other than the lima, lentil and soy, and all your other nuts, other than the almond and Brazil, have an acid effect. To maintain the 6.5 environment, we need to be consuming 20% acid-forming foods and 80%, 70 to 80% alkaline-forming foods. And I'm sure you're not surprised to hear me say that the 20% should come from this section here.
To maintain a healthy pH, she advises that 70 to 80% of the diet should be alkaline-forming foods, with only 20% being acid-forming. If you found this video informative, make sure to give a like, subscribe, and press the bell icon so that you won't miss out on any future videos.